Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to go out of my way to talk about the very first season of Gatchaman Crowds. So, I went into this show into Anime Bogo, Bogo. You can ultimately see this show there, or you can maybe probably see this on Funimation and stuff like that. So, ultimately, I went into this Gatchaman realizing that they had to like specifically mention like what their gotcha man was, because ultimately there had been a gotcha man previously before this. I had seen those visuals as well as these other visuals, and I was just kind of like, okay, like I can understand why they needed like a massive visual boost. So going into this show, I'm probably not going to be very much talking in a very much technical sounding terms and this and that. If anyways, I'm going to talk about this show very cryptically and then give you a double 5 time count and then go into spoilers about this show, whichever I really want to go into. Because this review might be much more vague than a lot of other reviews that I've done. Simply because for like this one, it's like this show starts out pretty strong, but then it kind of just like it kind of really does fall apart, and I'll explain why. Justifiably within this show, here are the positives. The visuals are very unique. I really like that these gotcha men, aka very much quasi comparing to the Power Rangers, because ultimately I'm going to make a lot of comparisons to the Power Rangers in this show. Just a ton of comparisons to that probably. So we have supposedly a new recruit to this Gotcha Man group. The only problem is there's never really seemingly a Gotcha Man group. So I just don't quite like what is the point of putting a group together if you don't actually fully fledgedly use every piece of this group, either every episode or every other episode, or like it just seems like they only used 2 people through 12 episodes of this anime. Here's a big problem. Ultimately, the new recruit that ends up getting added into this Gotcha Man, hopefully you really like this main character, because she talks a lot, and she's the main focal pointed character. Her voice, after a while, just really starts to sound like a nail on a chalkboard, and that's being brutally honest. But she just like is non-stop, just bah, 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 bah. All the while we have other people that I find more intriguing that barely have a time set in the sun, or like they just don't have enough time to otherwise just go, oh yeah, I like this character. I specifically liked Joe. Joe was probably my like favorite character visually, and just overall, just he was very intriguing, and he was the guy that like didn't say much, or he kind of felt like the quasi leader of this group, even though supposedly there was an actual leader, which honestly did not make sense to me. Um, there are some elements here of like Persona 5 at some point, or just the Persona series, but specifically Persona 5, from what I had seen from playing Persona 5. Uh, we we have our very much Zordon like character. If you guys remember the original Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, Zordon, we have like a Zordon like character that basically appears and gives people their powers, but then kind of after that, he's just a person that just sits around and cuts paper for for what seems like till the end of this show. Uh, there is a quasi real person who is kind of giving them the right act, giving them the rules, what they should and should not do. But most of the time, this character feels like a pushover. Uh, the like, if anything, the villains early on seem like nothing villains. Eventually, we do get a real arch nemesis esh like villain, and like we get kind of like a. I would call him kind of like a Death Note kind of like villain, or like a character that like I don't know. It just seems like a lot of the times they didn't want to do the actual Gatchaman point of this. There's so many times where they kind of really peel back away to keep having a human influence in the show rather than the actual like Gatchaman in full action, I guess, because those things were too difficult to continue to draw, I guess. Because if anything, yeah, definitely, I would say skip through probably half of episode 11 for people that yeah, basically skip through half of episode 11. That like I'll save you a lot of time if you're gonna go through this entire season and hope to eventually have this thing pick up at some point. If you want to skip through halfway through episode 11, because it's a bunch of recapping and it's a lot of just like reused footage scenes through half of an episode, which I was like, wow, that kind of, yeah. There is probably 1,000 ideas of how I could make this show 1,000% better. It probably might not be the best, greatest thing in our time, but man, like I'm sure people would be much more visually excited about what ideas I would bring to the table than what this story actually brought to the table. Um, yeah, at some points, in some junctures, and some this and that. Reasonably, it doesn't really feel like we really got a consensus on every single character, like every single person's backstory. There was even some times where I felt like characters were just there as fixtures, not really there as like that these characters were really going to be a thing in this show. Um, like you're putting a team together that I never quite understood. I never quite understood like you're putting a team together, but it seems like at best um, there are maybe really like three gotcha men like shown for the bulk of this, and then there's a fourth one that comes in, and then there's probably another one that actually kind of shows up more toward the very end, and then there's just like one girl that starts out in a bikini that what what did she ever really do in the show? I don't remember what she actually ever did in this show. Um, I don't remember. It was yeah. We ultimately have this show, I think, going on to a very like digital esh like villain. I think that's a smart idea. I think it was a smart idea to have some kind of mobile presence thing in this uh, in this show. I just really think that they could have really full on fledgedly done something way more with this, and I have a brilliant idea about how they could have really gone in depth on a lot of these things. A the Zordon Esh like character that they have gave these people all their powers. He really could have just been like a person that could have been um, probably stealing this idea from the 2016 Power Rangers movie. But why not have this person had been from TV? There's this channel that is always static. Like, how about we actually have a character that is from what would be the static universe, and he kind of uh, has it to where um, he ushers in and has all these Gatchamen be kids that love watching TV or playing video games or this and that, and he goes like, hey, like, I've been a friend with you for a very long time. We've shared a lot of good times and bad and this and that. So, um, like, I thought that you were the best. Like, I think that you're the best person to be ushered in as so and so gotcha man. Um, yeah, it never really feels like we got an individual like name between said gotcha man and person. Like, it's not like Joe had a separate like gotcha man name. It's just like, oh no, they're all just gotcha man. Shouldn't it be gotcha men? Or shouldn't it be like gotcha guys or gotcha girls or something like it should be like uh if anything, like there is a kind of very much each gotcha man kind of is kind of very individual. There's two characters that I kind of like at some point I'm just like I am tired of kind of hearing them speak. Like they're just kind of like ooh, yeah, ooh, yeah. It's like, oh my god, like that is just either too much energy for me or like too much just like and then also you have the one person that is reading out the rules and they also have to like it's kind of like a battle of who wants to be like the loudest person or just the most annoying person, and it's just like, man, this is just like, oh god. But yeah, supposedly this the leader, the real leader of this group is ultimately very much like the alpha 5 of this group, and ultimately like this person like has their own like certain persona. They're kind of like the rocket raccoon of this group. So, and they're not actually a raccoon, but we'll get to that. So ultimately we go into this and we have a new recruit who ultimately goes right into the Gatchaman, and I really like their Gatchaman headquarters. I really like their headquarters. It looks really artfully done. It maybe looks like a Jackson, or a not Jackson Pollock. Very much like if a Nickelodeon show wanted to put together a show, like this environment would probably be something that like it would be that it would be this thing, um, their headquarters. Eventually, they get to a point to where they ultimately have to repetitiously like be in this very weird, bizarrish, like circular like thing where each person has their own podium to like sit on and go and see their fearless, very tall Zordon-esh like leader, and ultimately he never says anything, and they're just kind of there, just like, okay, so what are we gonna do now? And like stuff comes from this by talking to one another, all the other group members, and and this and that. I never quite understand what is the point of what is the point of the Zordon Esh like leader guy. I didn't understand what is the point of this character. Why why did they always have to transition from places where like it could have been anywhere that they were like doing all this talking and whatever. At some points, it didn't need to be an important thing. Um, but yeah, when I mentioned like a static like person, like I'm talking like a static person that gets out of a screen and just he looks like static the entire time. You could have him be called like the Static Men, or the Static Man, or the Static. Uh, I don't know. But ultimately, it would be kind of an interesting story to have like maybe the static um, men versus like the new like high tech digital world. I don't know, like the mobile world or this and that. Like have it be the characters of the unliving or something like that um, going against the static world or the static man and his minions of Gatchaman. But anyways, mood point. So ultimately, yeah. So that's how exciting this show was. To where ultimately I was coming up with my own idea on how to make a much more intriguing show, because it never really like quite goes anywhere. You have this main character girl who's the new recruit who ultimately she she doesn't like the Gotcha Man rules. She doesn't like that the Gotcha Men don't want to go public. She doesn't like how the Gotcha Men have to very much in secret when they fight, and she ultimately is very much like wanting to be a hero no matter what because it's the right thing to do. And that's what you can like about this girl, but again, she's a little nail on the chalkboard, and I'm just like man, we have a group. Here's the thing, you need to really break this up. You can't have too much focus on one character when this is an ensemble piece. If this is clearly an ensemble piece, you should have just called it. If this is clearly not an ensemble piece, you should have just called this Gotcha Woman. That's what you should have just. You shouldn't have called it Gotcha Man. You should have called it Gotcha Woman, because reasonably, like if she's the main focus and like all the people are just kind of just like there, like ultimately you have a Gotcha Man that is ultimately like used with her, uh, but it's always a team of two or a team of one or like they're like that was a disappointing thing. It was just like, man, you have an ensemble piece that you're not using, and like here's how you can make every episode different. Here's like you could have an episode per one character, having us in the first half of this season investing in each individual gotcha man, but instead like and we don't really have any kind of like, you know how on Power Rangers they would always have like these minion esh like characters that would come out and attack the Power Rangers. Like we don't really have much like that. We just kind of have eventually just like a hero that kind of looks like a very severely long haired like Joker ripoff, and like he's kind of the villain for this thing, and like I was expecting something a little bit like more. I was thinking something a little bit smarter. I was thinking something that didn't quite feel like thrown together. Or I was just kind of like, and here's the hilarious thing in this show, like this Joker esh like ripoff character. It's hilarious to me how they consistently have to relentingly say that this villain character, is way too powerful. They never they only have one Gotcha Man fight this villain at one time. Here's the thing. How about you have multiple Gotcha Man fighting this guy at one time, wouldn't you think? Like Power Rangers, Ninja Turtles, any group of any kind, you have the entire group fight this one individual to take him down. And that never comes up, or rarely come, like, ultimately, like, they wait to really do a group thing till it's too late. Till basically it's just like, well, like, this villain is like controlling the world, and like he is like trying to make this threat happen. It gets to the point where eventually, like, it's like, you know what, this, like, the threats that the Gatchamen were facing were too small and not quite significant enough, and I will explain why in spoilers. So at the end of the day, I think it's about time to do that. From what is left, for me to ultimately kind of spoil and this and that. So yeah, Gotcha Man, like, this show had so much potential, and I was just kind of like, when is it gonna pick up? When is it gonna pick up? And it never quite got there for me. Like, it never, I was just like, there's so many missed opportunities in this series that it's almost hilarious. Like, I know that this show wanted to try as much as possible to not be like Power Rangers, but like, it's kind of blatantly obvious that this, like, was almost trying to feel like that, but also doing something different. And like, but yeah, it just didn't quite get the motor running. It didn't quite get off the cliff, to start that jump. It just kind of like, it caught you at first, and then so you're like, oh man, I gotta see when this show like really like starts to escalate and starts to use all these people, and it never really quite does. It never really quite does. I was expecting a real, true, legitimate team, and we never got there. Which is like, man, I was waiting for a really good Power Rangers like parody Ash like thing out of an anime, and this was not quite ever there. So hopefully I can find a Power Rangers parody that actually is really solidly good or about the same. I know Emo Rangers is a thing. I've seen that, and it's really hilarious and or funny. So yeah, if you can't quite get a good Power Rangers parody-ish kind of fix, I guess Emo Rangers would have to be that, because ultimately there are very few other options that are reasonably good Power Rangers esque like shows that are done in anime form. But I could be wrong about that, because ultimately it gets down to the point where like they've kind of done everything at some points. But ultimately, I would love to see Samurai Flamenco or whatever it's called, but ultimately that show isn't in English, and it probably won't ever be in English, because it didn't quite make enough money to justify it getting dubbed in English, sadly enough, from what I've learned. So let's get into spoilers about this show, because again, like, I'm going off so many off beaten paths in this review. I do apologize, but like, yeah, this was a like rough ride for me, because I'm like, this show has a lot of potential. This show has a lot of interesting visuals, and I'm just waiting for it to give me something, and it sabotaged itself, sadly enough. At some points, there could be a debating on whether this show was really good, but like ultimately, like it was almost to the point where I almost wanted this show to just be kind of as a background noise and have me doing like legitimately something else, just kind of hearing what's going on. Even though I liked the visuals of this show, it just really just like I was just kind of like, man, this needs to pick up. This is a action show that doesn't want to be an action show. It wants to be a like it wants to like not be that, and I'm just so confused why that like if you look at the other Gotcha Man and you look at this, it's like night and day. It's weird. It's weird. So if anything, let's get into it. So spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time I get to spoil the show. I wouldn't say that this is a bad show. Like I left kind of with a bitter taste or kind of disappointment in my mouth just because I was like, man, this has a lot of potential to do something, and it just kept flopping around like a fish past like the first at least one or two episodes. Because I was just like, man, like this could be something, and just so. Anyways, we have a new recruit, and ultimately, this new recruit is at school. We have a very tall, odd looking man with white hair and is just really tall and has this really weird, like, big coat thing that ultimately appears to this girl. And ultimately has her, like, he ultimately wraps his coat around her and ultimately shows him like I would guess and call it like this very rainbow-ish like scenario. I would probably call it like a morphing grid. Again, the Power Ranger fan in me. Like I would call it like the Gatchaman like energy force or something. And so ultimately this guy is like telling her it's like, hey, you're like the chosen one, and like I know that like that in your heart that you like have this ability to be a gotcha man. And so he uh puts his hand through her chest and ultimately takes out this what is called a notebook, but it's also like a morpher. It's also like a morphing thing for her to use. Um, like in some kind of later Ash like seasons of like Power Rangers, when basically they would have like all kinds of different kind of morphers, where it got to a point where it seems like they would use like cell phones as like a morpher or something like that. Like this is kind of like that same thing. It's kind of like they used a phone or a cell phone, like a unique cell phone, as a not only morpher, but like it's kind of funny that they kind of wrote like they would write things into this notebook and it would be sent to somebody. I'm like, that's basically like you texting someone or you like sending somebody an email. It's basically the same thing. Like like it's kind of as if like this thing was like a prototype for what exactly a cell phone would be at some points. Um, and plus, like these people are kind of addicted to this like mobile game that like kind of tells them like where everyone is and stuff like that. So called the crowd. Uh, yeah, there's some mobile game called the crowd that like seemingly everybody uses, and with this crowd you have this internet entity that ultimately can that you can kind of eventually see at some point, or ultimately can be a real presence, I guess, in life, I guess, which is weird. But anyways, we go into this and we have this new girl who is ultimately just a super chatty Kathy, and she is consistently just saying gotcha, gotcha, gotcha. Like, if you want to do a drink count of how many times they legitimately say either gotcha or like gotcha man in this show, you are gonna be like dead because they say it a lot. Specifically gotcha, um, specifically. So this girl, like, she ends up seeing the performance of one of her other like gotcha men, who is ultimately going into this mall to seek out this, like, I would call it like a Rubik's cube. Like, he ultimately is tracking down this Rubik's cube looking thing, that ultimately at first looks like a person, but then turns into this Rubik's cube thing. He attacks this thing, takes it down with his sword because his specialty is battling with a katana or a sword or whatever. And I'm just like, okay, like, this is kind of interesting. And so basically, like, after like he had put on the amnesia ray that ultimately is going to make all other normal people that aren't gotcha men all just like not remembering all of this stuff that he had done. He, like, it's kind of like the red dot thing from Men in Black where they hit the thing and then like people forget what happens. It's kind of like the same thing. So he eventually attacks this Rubik's Cube looking thing, because that's all I can say of what it really is. Like, the original, like, the very, like, when this thing comes into, like, all these, like, colored block, like, things as, like, a human being, like, I would be like, man, why isn't that this thing, like, why isn't that, like, this Gotcha Man isn't attacking, like, a thing that looks like a human, but it's a bunch of, like, little tiny boxes all put together. But instead, it just turns into this Rubik's Cube, and then this guy's fighting this Rubik's Cube, and I'm like, okay, hopefully this isn't like the entire show. But this ends up being some alien entity that they have to fight off. But bizarrely, this Rubik's Cube like entity at some point just eventually just becomes their friend, or becomes like nice to them, or they may have not understood exactly this entity and what it wants, because eventually they become friends with it. And I'm like, what? I'm like, this, like, why? Why have this thing be a thing in this show, ultimately to try to figure out a way to eventually get rid of it at some point? Like, and just it was rough. It's rough, but if anything, eventually, like, let's get back to the opening pilot, because I've done so many tangents and I've jumped around so much already in this review. So we ultimately have the girl meeting the guy, and she's like, well, I guess I'm a gotcha man because I saw you do your gotcha man thing. Like, I didn't believe that, like, gotcha man was really real, but it seems like people are starting to come to the consensus about this whole gotcha man thing, even though there's no way that they should be able to know about this gotcha man thing, because ultimately, yeah, like, people shouldn't know about this, but they do. So the girl is basically like, the rules is that they are wanting as much as possible for people to not know about Gatchaman. And she's like, well, the news technically already knows about the Gatchaman. Why not just go out in public and just finally admit that we're Gatchaman and we're trying to protect them from some villainous entity? So eventually the two ultimately go into their like headquarters, and they meet all the other Gatchaman that evidently have nothing better to do but to just kind of like stand around and just kind of meet the new girl, because heaven forbid any other people besides these two other people have anything to do in this entire story. We have a girl in this bikini that basically is the biggest log of this entire show. Like, she, I think, heals somebody in one episode, but I do not know that she actually ever does anything in the show that is worthwhile. Um, I just, I'm like, is she ever? Does she really ever actually do anything in the show? I don't even remember if she actually even does anything ever in the show. I just didn't know she was a person in this thing. We eventually meet Joe, the coolest looking gotcha man, but barely. Like, I'm like, when are we gonna see more Joe? When are we gonna see this Joe guy? I was like, oh my god, this is like the coolest looking gotcha man, and he's like scarcely being used, and I'm like, and then there's this other guy that is supposedly like presenting that he's like a magician, and he has a very high voice, and like ultimately he is just like this supposed alien from another place, and eventually we have this Persona 5-ish looking character. Then in Persona 5 we have a cat in Persona 5 that like is almost as close to a human. Like in this show we have a character that looks very much supposedly like a panda, but I would call it like Casper the Friendly Ghost with ears, really, because that's what it looks like for the most point. And it also has feet as well. So Casper the Friendly Ghost with hands and legs and ears, but that's basically what it looks like. Put them side by side, they look like the same thing. And this entity, when called that it's a panda, it's like, no, I'm nothing like a panda. But they visually look the same freaking thing. This character, the panda-looking character, is very annoying at a lot of times because she is the strict person that is ultimately saying that she is the leader of this group, but it kind of gets down to a point where she doesn't lead the team very well, and she eventually goes into like some kind of I would call it drunken stupor, where she just kind of contemplates like, man, I am the worst leader. Man, how why is it that I failed so badly at being the leader of this? Well, she never really leads anybody. Everybody takes a lot of stuff upon themselves. There's just a lot of times where people, the Gotchamen, just talk to one another, and this and that. There's no like nobody is really actually handing down anybody to do whatever. Like everybody is just gung hoingly doing whatever they want, whenever they have time to do whatever they want. And so realistically, we find this like gold, like very much, like I would call it uh like a very like a bunch of like rings, and each one of these rings have like a stepping stone, uh kind of like, or like it's a like imagine a big gold ring, and that ring has like gold steps to it, uh like all the way down from the top of the ring to the very bottom. And then there is like this supposed point where like you would think that you're going to fall to your death, but instead that is just an illusion, because ultimately the one girl like really just wants to sit right next to the Zordon looking guru-esh like character that consistently just cuts paper with a pair of scissors. And this girl's like, oh my god, I love your scissors. And ultimately, the weapon that she eventually ends up using for bulk of this show is a pair of scissors. This girl eventually ends up being this, like, I would call it like a fashion and or like very poppy kind of gotcha man, where Joe ends up being very much more like a daredevil esh like gotcha man. Um, and eventually the guy with the sword, he kind of looks just kind of like a severely generic robot esh looking thing. Um, we eventually have the guy with the bizarrish top hat. Like, he eventually, like, at the very tail end of the episode, I think that's it. He uses like his like he has this like very severely like gold costume, which I was ultimately just like, wow, this actually looks really awesome. But heaven forbid you actually have this character like he just sits in the headquarters and that's all he does all the time. To the point to where eventually he's just there to talk to the younger people. He's just there, and eventually he's just like, well, I guess I should actually go and actually do something because like I don't want to like start growing roots or start getting rust here just sitting in this headquarters. Yeah, because he never gets used. He never does anything. And like you have the bikini girl, which I don't like. I don't even remember what she does in this show. Besides heal somebody in a by a bathtub. It's the only thing I remember her doing, just because that's how important she was. We eventually have the panda character that eventually turns into this like weird, bizarrish, like like car-esh looking thing, but he like the panda character looks much more like a transformer than anything else. But I'm sure maybe that girl, I'm assuming, did morph to a character at some point. The girl that just heals people in a tub. Like I think she might have morphed once or twice, but like it kind of again. I think that's why it's kind of like, oh, she's in the screen, so I don't need to care about her because like she does like it doesn't even seem like she really says much or does much or just like I just didn't care. So Joe is probably the coolest character, but you only have him really used, and I think a bulk of the time in his actual Gatchaman suit, like twice in 12 episodes. Good job with that. And then maybe sometimes when he's actually in the group of Gatchaman, like he's placed in there. So, like, three times out of 12 episodes. Great. Great. But yeah, so eventually we have to go in and fight these Rubik's Cube things again, but again, eventually they bizarrely have like the one last Rubik's Cube thing ends up being the friend of the girl. Sure, why not? And so eventually they have to come up with an actual villain in this show, and they end up coming up with this like Joker ripoff esh looking character that basically looks like Joker from like nose down, and then like his hair is like super long to where you don't even see his eyes, and just super long, and it's like a weird looking like purple, but it's like a light purple, and like this character has like these tattoos. He has this like weird like weapon that looks just like a bunch of lines mixed together, like a bunch of just like it kind of looks like a tail made out of lines. Realistically, that's what it looks like this weapon is. But I guess it could be like a tail or like a like if a chain was done poorly, was drawn poorly, like this is what this thing would look like. And so yeah, eventually you have this character that his main power is that when he kisses people, he can copy the way people look. And eventually that person usually dies or otherwise goes crazy and like starts killing people. Then eventually he just becomes this person. it gets to the point where this guy starts using people that have like a big uh, technological reach, and he eventually starts using people because he tells them it's like, well, yeah, I was supposedly sent here to help people, also known as he's lying. He's actually wanting to destroy the world, and like I wanted your help. Well, eventually this girl it becomes very naive. This pink-haired girl that consistently looks like a bunny, but then again, you don't know if this is a like. There's so many times where at some points you don't know whether a person is a girl and or guy or not, which is kind of sad. Like kind of the way some of these characters are designed, you're just like, I am kind of confused whether or not to call this a guy and or girl because ultimately a lot of times like the character designs are kind of very confusing. Even when these people talk, you can't clearly exactly define. Um, you can't define, so ultimately you're just like person who had tech stuff. There's ultimately a girl that owns the crowd, and she is ultimately kind of getting business execs or something. Some people calling her, and like very much like mentioning to this person that if it's a her and or him, I don't know. I'm assuming it's a boy. I would assume this black haired boy. Yeah, I assume because again, the person that owns the crowd, uh, going to them and ultimately saying that like this wasn't the person that they thought they were, and ultimately that uh, this person isn't going to take the next step of this crowd, like use the crowd for its real and true benefit. So we take a lot of time for that, and I didn't understand why. Because a lot of jargon there that I was just like, why do I care? If this character is not the villain in this show, why set them up? If none of these characters really in true like we didn't even barely get to know what the villain was. The villain like didn't really have much of an actual like it didn't really seem like the villain had much of a backstory to really comb through, and like this villain was severely bland, and it was just like, man, this character like there's something about him, there's something there, there's some potential there, but it just feels squandered by just like we just needed a villain in this show and here you go. But yeah, so eventually we have Joe consistently trying to fight this. I'll call him Joker knockoff, and and ultimately he continues to fail because every single time he has to finally get up to snuff and actually fight somebody and actually do something in this thing, because a lot of times he's either sleeping or he's doing his I think his reporter job. Where ultimately a lot of like there's one point where ultimately um like one of his people that he knows is telling him it's like, God, why aren't they actually doing something? And Joe mentions like, well, we're doing as the best we can. And she's like, wait, what are you talking about? And he's like, oh yeah, you must mean like the police. Like he was thinking that like she was saying like the Gatchaman. Um, like yeah, we're really doing the best we can. Yeah, you guys are sitting around doing nothing. Like a lot of the times your biggest hitter is sitting on the sidelines just going, well, like I'm just going to be annoying and talk to people, and he doesn't get his freaking like he doesn't get his bat prepped and up to the line of scrimmage to ultimately take a pitch until like the very last episode, and he finally like fights the actual villain, and at that point it's like the villain turns into this like other different thing that they both fight against, and of course good guys win. um but yeah, it's just because eventually the villain eventually like uh breaks into the Gatchaman headquarters, confronts their not so verbal leader that consistently cuts paper all the time, and I guess that's like his jam, cutting paper. He eventually like they eventually fight in these headquarters. They eventually like destroy some of the headquarters, and eventually like yeah, eventually like good guys win. But all the while, eventually we get to where everybody goes into crowd and this and that and tries to take down these like mini villains, these little small villains. Everybody bizarrely gets a smartphone, and they become these crowd entities, and they take down all of these like nano villains, like nano hunt. They become like nano hunters or whatever that are trying to take down all these villainish esh like things, because the Gotcha Man can't do anything because the heroes of this story can't do anything because they never really get together as a team that often, because reasons. So um yeah, so I think at the end of the day that is probably how the show really just kind of just ends. It kind of ends on just like, because at one point like they eventually go out into the public and showcase that like, hey, we're gotcha men, and we're gonna show you how we morph. We're gonna show you like we're gonna show you everything. We're gonna go full force in the public because we feel we need to, because one of the girls needs to, because she had ultimately at some point been outed by some cameras somewhere, and so ultimately she's like, well, why can't we just tell them like we're gotcha men? Like this is stupid. Like ultimately, a lot of people already technically know gotcha men exist. Like ultimately, like blowing up my social medias asking me about gotcha men and stuff like that, because everybody thinks that they know I'm a gotcha man. So how about we just confirm what people already know? Let's go out there and just go in public. And the panda is just like, no, there's rules. And it's like, well, who cares? So they go out and they go onto the public and they showcase themselves in front of a school, in front of kids. And eventually the government kind of gets involved, and not only the news, but then the government kind of gets involved in this and are trying to tell people what to do. All the while the gotcha men are like grabbing the government officials so that way they can do public announcements. And you have a government official that's on some like YouTube live feed or something, and he's screaming at all of his like potential voters, and he's like, "Oh, shut up! I don't like that you're like." He's the prime minister or whatever, and he's screaming at all of his like people through a live stream, and he's just like, you don't know how stressful this is," and like, "Oh, you're saying this crap about me now? Oh, f you and then this and that," and like f that, no, just like, you don't know how hard this is. Like you don't get it. And then he's just like, oof, man. Then he goes into the like the speech that he's was supposed to read for people to do all this stuff. So like overall, like that's just kind of what happens on the show. I really, as quickly as humanly possible, grazed through it because I don't feel even for 12 episodes there was enough going on in this show. There wasn't enough going on the show that felt like if anything you could have kind of cut this show in half. Like, cuz ultimately it's just there was a lot of like filler in this show. There was a lot of times where it was just like justifiable. I'm like, do we really need to take this time in the show to do these things? I don't think so. But like when looking at the show like Voltron, or looking at Power Rangers, or looking at a lot of the shows that end up would probably lead to a Gatchaman, like looking at those other shows in comparison, like half of the stuff that they did on like Power Rangers, I don't feel like Gatchaman like took a lot of influence of that and kind of did stuff similar to that. Like I know there is kind of stuff here and there, but dare say it's just kind of like I don't know, like there was never a team that like I guess in like the early episodes of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, like there were certain dedicational episodes for certain Rangers, but then again, it wasn't always one Ranger 24/7, and like that's it. Like it would always showcase kind of around like okay, we're gonna have an episode about Tommy, we're gonna have an episode about Adam, we're gonna have an episode about Rocky, we're gonna have an episode about so and so other people, and but then again, eventually they would come together as a team somewhere in the episode. But in this one, no, 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 no. We have one person showcase, and then everybody else is just kind of done as like I guess we need to have this in here somewhere. But yeah, so that's all I think I'm going to say about the show. So ultimately, who knows if people are going to watch this review. Maybe people will have different opinions about this, or ultimately, they will just be like, why review this show? I don't know. Like I was really hoping it was gonna pick up, or it was gonna really like give me like something to go ooh ah. But if anything, it just kind of like ah. It's like ah. It doesn't like eh. Want so badly. I wanted this so badly to just like tickle my fancy, but instead it tickled my just utterly just like God, the show could have been 1,000% better. And I hope someday that eventually they attempt another kind of Gatchaman quasi like this, but they do it so much better. If there's probably another season of this, I don't think so. I would probably check it out, but again, I won't check it out if it's the same roster. If it's the same characters, like I have no interest. If it's kind of like the same kind of approaches, I don't think I can just like. As soon as I figure out like who the villain is in the show, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm done. Like, who's the main villain? This person? Oh, okay, well, I'm done. Because it's just if there's a really good Power Rangers parody or kind of quasi similar thing, I'll go and check it out. But without a doubt, Gatchaman is probably not going to be one of those. Ultimately, yeah, like I'm sure a lot of people ultimately throw out Ultron. I don't really care for Ultron. I don't really care for Ultron. So I'm going to care my way out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.